Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you is evidence of the efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccine for children. European regulators have approved the Pfizer vaccine for children as well. This, along with other evidence, would indicate that there's a growing acceptance of it. There is also some degree of pushback, with people arguing that there's a risk of heart inflammation. But what is the actual risk? Finally, for COVID-19, there's yet a new variant, although the exact implications are not yet known. Other treatment news is a nasal spray for Alzheimer's disease, and interesting new cells involved in the heart and just how it beats. There's also one of the world's largest organisms being slowly destroyed. The timestamp for these news items and others can be found in the description box below. Let's start with the benefit of the Pfizer vaccine for children. There is some contention about the idea of vaccinating 12 to 15-year-olds to stop them from getting infected with COVID-19. The argument is it doesn't affect them very much. While in this case, the argument is they should be vaccinated because this study has demonstrated that it will not affect them at all for up to 4 months after being given their second dose of the vaccine. Not at all is a significant improvement over not much. Admittedly, it is a late phase 3 trial with a little over 2,200 participants, so we're not talking very small numbers, but we're not also talking about very large-scale trial numbers either. Despite that, it's very clearly safe and very effective. That safety and efficacy is incredibly important when we're looking at the fact that with new variants of the COVID-19 virus infecting younger and younger age groups with more serious symptoms, the ability to vaccinate them, and in this case provide nearly perfect protection, is very important. This news comes in the same week that America is reporting at least 93,000 new cases as Americans head into their annual holiday. The idea being that at the moment, everybody is traveling back home if possible to spend Thanksgiving with their family. This has led to a nearly 30% increase in case count over the last 2 weeks. This equates to 94,000 or near enough to new cases. This is a similar peak to what we've seen in the last 2 years of the COVID-19 virus being part of our lives. Each time November has come around, there has been a significant peak as we enter into this time of year and it grows. That is a surge, and it's likely that we may experience yet another. Some states are experiencing a doubling of their daily case count as a consequence of this. Part of this could be a combination of travel, exposure, new variants, and so on, but a very large proportion comes down to the fact that more than 41% of the US population is not fully vaccinated. That is 41% of the population that can carry the COVID-19 virus and infect others. While large parts of America have effectively rejected the vaccine at the moment, European Union regulators have approved the Pfizer vaccine. Not just have they approved it, but they've approved it for young children, those between the ages of 5 and 11. This is of course not the same strength dose as what they would give to an adult. In fact, it's a much lower strength dose. Arguably, this only makes sense. Smaller people, smaller doses. Despite the fact that it is only 1/3 of the dose for adult individuals, it elicits the same degree of immunological response and same kind of antibody response. This kind of vaccine and the fact that it's being approved for children is very important. As of last week, there were a little over 2,200 cases per 100,000 amongst 5 to 14-year-olds. More than double what is the national figure. That means children have twice as many infections as adults do. Considering that children are one of the few groups that can move around locations regularly this is a big problem. Traveling to school, social events, sports, home, and so on. They act as a very effective transport and vector of infection, especially when we're talking about the Delta variant. This is why the news that they are approving it for children is so important. There has and continues to be an argument that if you get the vaccine and you are a child, you're at risk of heart inflammation. And this is somewhat true. There is a very small and minor chance that you may well get heart inflammation from the vaccine. This risk is substantially lower than the risk of heart inflammation from being infected by the COVID-19 virus. This then becomes a question: which would you prefer, the predictable and more effectively dealt with heart inflammation from vaccine, or the unpredictable and far more difficult to control heart inflammation from being infected? Random chance is often a far worse fate. This, of course, assumes that you are one of that very small fraction that might be at risk of some sort of inflammatory response. A very tiny, tiny percentage. For the rest of the people, and especially children who are being vaccinated, there is absolutely no significant risk to speak of. This is why the current view of it is almost entirely driven by the media, and the media simply going for an emotional knee-jerk response to something along the lines of, won't somebody think of the children? Next is still on the COVID-19 virus, but an interesting article that looks at one of the more bizarre claims that we've seen. Ivermectin is responsible for the sudden downturn in COVID-19 diagnoses in Japan. We've already spoken about how COVID-19 has had many drugs tested to see if they might be used. Some of these have had initial evidence to support their use, and then later disproven. Ivermectin is in the latter category. The issue with ivermectin is that there are some other drugs that are also protease inhibitors. These are not the same kind of protease inhibitors, and as such, are not interchangeable. There are many who, for lack of a better word for this, are completely ignorant or insane and believe they are. These two scenarios do not excuse the fact that they get something so very wrong with it. It's also why ivermectin does not solve the issue and is not why Japan has seen a significant decrease in the number of COVID-19 cases. The article gives a good explanation of not only the timeline of events, but why the idea that ivermectin is responsible for the drop is nonsensical. The short version of all of this is that Japan had a sudden increase, a local medical group advised its use, then suddenly there was a decrease. This decrease also followed wide-sweeping government changes and implementation of laws that gave them all the power, including lockdowns and the prevention of movement of people. You can imagine how suddenly stopping any movement and consequential exposure to COVID-19 would cause a sudden drop in the number of cases. Simple, common sense applied with just a little bit of lateral thinking, and suddenly you have a far more realistic explanation than how a small local medical group caused a nationwide change in case count. The final piece of COVID-19 news we have for you this week regards a new South African variant. Admittedly, this new South African variant is just that, and there's no knowledge of exactly what's happening with it. The only information of any certainty is that it has a high number of mutations within its genome. That is a concern. The various variants of the COVID-19 virus that have been a big problem or associated with increased infectious nature have all had a number of mutations. If this also has similar mutations that increase its infectious rate, or the number of people who will die due to being more infectious or causing more deaths. That is a concern, and it's what the South African Health Minister believes has happened, that this new, highly mutated version is responsible for an increase in cases. On the other side of that coin, without better knowledge of exactly what is happening with this new mutation and what has changed, it could be that the new variant has no relationship to that sudden increase in case count. Going from the COVID-19 virus to herpes. Herpes is an interesting virus, primarily because of how it hides from the immune system. It sits in our nervous system and waits to come back out after the immune system has stopped doing what it does. By hiding in the nervous system, the immune system largely leaves it alone. This is one reason why shingles occurs in the elderly. It's effectively chickenpox, but a resurgence of chickenpox once their immune system has been dampened a bit and can no longer control any outbreaks. Normally, the immune system is very good at keeping things out from where they should be. That means your immune system doesn't allow for your neurons to be infected, and when they do become infected, the neurons have to have either been somehow tricked into letting the infection in, or the infectious pathogen has to have found a way to get into the neuron that doesn't use or exploit something within the neuron. That's where the question of just how exactly herpes does what it does comes into play. Much like with the COVID-19 virus, it uses a protein, or at least a protein that allows it to be able to lock into and use various parts of the cell. In the case of COVID-19, this is a spike protein and the ACE receptors. For herpes, it's something called PUL36, and it's a protein that locks into molecules of something called dynein. These are one of their mechanisms, or motors for lack of a better word, that help to keep a cell in a given shape. The protein allows the herpes virus to use these little motors or engines that travel around the cell and keep things the way they should be, and move into the nucleus where the DNA is. The herpes virus can then incorporate into this genome, and from here can begin making more herpes viruses, which can then be released and infect more cells. Being able to not only deal with herpes allows it to be dealt with directly, but could play a role in being able to deal with diseases like dementia, where it's thought to at least be a contributing factor, if not one of the many causes behind it. This week also has news about another neuropathology, specifically Alzheimer's. Last week we spoke about how Alzheimer's is caused by tau proteins and how there is very early animal research that would allow the immune system to attack the protein bundles within the brain that are the cause of Alzheimer's disease. This nasal spray is something similar, but it's also completely different. Last week's treatment used a vaccine, but it was only in animal models. This week's vaccine is a nasal spray that's administered twice in a very small cohort of 16 people. This then helps the immune system to develop a way of getting rid of those tau protein bundles in the brain. Unlike last week, where they were expressly trying to only give the immune system a very wide but very specific set of antigen targets, this instead gives the immune system the means of attacking those protein bundles directly and developing the antibodies it needs. In other physiology and anatomy related news, it could be that there is a new kind of cell in the heart, and that this new kind of cell could be responsible for keeping your heart beating in the right way. The heart beats regularly and to a very specific rhythm. Without this, blood would not flow through the chambers in the heart in the right order. Without that, blood would not flow in only one direction, and blood may not flow at all. In order to ensure that, there are very specific checkpoints in the heart and in the way the neurons in the heart release the necessary electrical signal to cause it to beat. This is where the new type of glial cell comes into play. These are cells which are often found only in the brain and spinal cord, generally nowhere else in the body. They have, however, been found within certain parts of the heart now, and this is where things get just a little bit interesting. This is the part of the heart where congenital heart defects are often found. What researchers found is that when you remove these cells from the heart rate increases. If you block the genetic processes that involve these, during the embryonic development, the heartbeat also becomes irregular. It helps that these are cells that are known to be involved in the brain in neural pruning and controlling growth in the brain during early development. If this is equally true of the heart, then it may be that there's a neurological reason underlying some of the neuropathologies that we see within the heart, leading to things like palpitations. In news that will get your heart rate up, an Australian zoo has adopted a very large spider. A spider with fangs so big that they can go through your fingernail. Although, technically, fang is not the correct term in this instance, but it'll do for now. It is a large female funnel web spider. And yes, it had to be in Australia because where else would you find giant creepy animals? And technically it's not a zoo either, so this piece of news is full of all manner of technicalities. It was a reptile park instead. Still, it's involved in animal conservation and care, so we'll call it a zoo for now. The spider has been adopted not only because it's incredibly large, but because said spider can also be milked. Milking spiders is not an unusual event in Australia. There are many species that are highly venomous, and they are milked for their venom, which is then used to produce antivenom. By getting such a large specimen, they can not only get public coverage like this, but they can also get a large amount of venom. To give some context to the funnel web spider, typically they're about 4 to 5 centimeters around. This one is closer to 8 centimeters, that being more than a 50% increase in size. Also a size that is similar to some tarantula species. In other wildlife or nature-related news, there is a very large copse of trees in the US that are dying off. Strictly speaking, we should call this copse of tree, as there's only one tree that spreads out over a very large area. Each trunk in this 106-acre area, as we see it, is in fact a clone of the original. The trunk is just one tall standing trunk from an underground root mass that spreads over an enormous area. That means each and every one is genetically identical. As the various quasi-trunks fall, light hits the ground and it stimulates the development of a new trunk to be formed. The weird giant aspen tree here is currently in danger, primarily because the youngest trees that would normally take over when the older ones die off, roughly every 130 years, are being eaten. The deer and elk find them edible, and since wolves and cougars in the area are being kept in check by humans, the herbivores are increasing in population. This means that they will go for anything and everything that they can eat, including the aspen tree that makes up so much of this area's ecosystem. The giant aspen copse is also being affected by 3 simultaneous diseases, all of which can affect it much more easily because it is one giant clone. These being sooty bark canker, leaf spot, and conch fungal disease. Because the entire organism is just one clone of itself, if one tree can be infected, they can all be infected. The final piece of news we have for you this week is more of a sci-fi film plot than it is actual news at this stage. NASA is launching a rocket that is intended to send an asteroid off of its current course lest it should hit Earth. The mission is called the Double Asteroid Redirection Test, or DART. It's intended to send the rocket roughly 7 million miles, or for those of us who use civilized numbers, approximately 12.6 million kilometers, in order to then push a box that is approximately 1.22 meters out that will then impact with the very large asteroid, redirecting it with just the smallest nudge so that it avoids Earth. Yeah, this might well have been the original plot for Armageddon, but it's not. The reason this is called a double test is that the first part of it is simply being able to get the rocket with its payload to the asteroid. Consider 12.6 million kilometers away. That's well and truly beyond anything that most people could consider sending into space now and being able to reliably hit without some really strong backing behind it. And that's the first issue NASA is going to have to deal with. The second one is, what happens when you actually get there and start interacting with the object? Will you actually be able to redirect it with enough force to send it off of its current trajectory? Put this in a little more context. We won't actually know if it has reached its intended destination until September 2022. That is approximately 10 months from now. 10 months to travel 12.6 million kilometers and hope to hit a target approximately 780 meters across. This is a target approximately the same diameter across as 5.5 Great Pyramids, or roughly 20 Arc de Triomphes. The only hiccup with this plan at the moment is that the intended targets of Didymos and Dimorphos pose no threat to Earth, and one is in fact a moon of the other. That could now be taken as an act of war or aggression against any aliens that happen to be located near, or as a consequence of redirecting, these asteroids. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.